Hello, we want to welcome you to the Heights podcast. My name is Lee, and I'm one of the pastors here at Heights, and I'm joined today by our pastor of worship and media, Pastor Matt Hogan. And we are in a series of podcasts through the end of Mark, and what we've been doing on Sunday morning is just been taking a sermon at a time, a chapter at a time through the Gospel of Mark. And so that sermon series is titled Servant King. So if you'd like to catch up with that on our YouTube page, feel free to do that. And so over the last couple of podcasts, we've been looking at passages, Matt, that we really haven't had time to deal with on a Sunday morning in the sermon because I'm limited by time.
Right.
Nobody wants to sit here for an hour and a half and listen to me preach. So we have to kind of pick a chunk of that passage. And then what we've been doing on the last couple of podcasts is kind of going over some things we may have skipped, didn't have time to really kind of do more of a deep dive into. So this is kind of the podcast after the sermon type thing. And so today we are in Mark chapter 14. And last time we talked about Mark 13 with the abomination of desolation and all that. So that was a good one. But in Mark 14, we're picking up here with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Mm-hmm. And so what we want to look at today is verse 36, where Jesus says, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but you will." And there's an interesting kind of discussion that goes on with that. So give us kind of a little background and what's happening and why that's an interesting verse that Christ is kind of praying like, okay, is there another way or what are we doing here, guys? So
Right. It's interesting because remember, this is God's plan for redemption goes all the way back to the opening pages of the Bible.
Right.
It's in Genesis chapter 3, that prophecy comes that that He's going to send the one who's going to crush the head of the snake. And so one of the ways I like to think about it is Jesus wasn't plan B.
Yeah.
Paul talks about people, God choosing people for salvation from the foundations of the earth. Mm-hmm. In other words, so there was this plan of redemption that came all. It's not like mankind disobeyed and then God had to sort of like scramble and come up with and do damage control. It's like, no, this was always His plan. The whole story of the Bible is leading up to this moment.
Right.
But Jesus, remember what we understand about Jesus is that He is fully man and He is fully God. Mm-hmm. So He is 100% aware of the plan and of the timing and that the fullness of time has come and this is His moment where He's going to offer up His life for the salvation of the world. But in His humanity, this is what He's going to face, in the next day is just going to be awful.
Right.
And so I think you're really seeing in Jesus' humanity sort of the struggle between knowing this is God's plan and just desperately wanting there to be another way, wishing in His humanity to not have to go through the agony that's going to be involved with the scourging and the cross and all of that.
Yeah, because timeline, we're late Thursday, mm-hmm. And so you've obviously had, as we've seen through the book of Mark, as we've gone through it on Sunday mornings, there's 3 incidences that Jesus clearly says, hey guys, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to Jerusalem, going to be betrayed, going to be crucified, going to rise from the dead.
Yeah, He knows it's coming.
He knows it's coming. They've just had the Lord's Supper where He's like, one of you's going to betray me. Peter, you're going to deny me. So that's after the supper. So it's later Thursday. And this is where He's in in Gethsemane beginning to pray, knowing full aware that this is about to happen. I think what's interesting too, when we stop and think about this prayer, is to even to back up and you're right, it's all the way back in Genesis 3:15, that first prophecy of the Messiah. You go to Isaiah 53, Isaiah, the Lord's going to lay the iniquity of us all on Him. Mm-hmm. And so the whole Bible's pointing to this moment. Psalm, 22. Christ obviously is aware of that. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became God, and the Word was with God. This is the Word become flesh, so none of this is catching Him off guard. But I like to stop and think about it, that this didn't have to be God's plan. Meaning, God didn't have to redeem us.
Right.
Like, God didn't have to redeem mankind at all. He was not obligated to redeem and save any of us. So when we think about the cross, I think sometimes we think like God may owe us a second chance, or like, hey, God, I wasn't that bad, so maybe like you owe me a little something. It's like, no, God doesn't owe us salvation. We're the ones who've sinned against him, but out of his love, he chose this plan. Before the foundation of the world, the Bible says. So even before he knew, he created us, and we were going to go wacky and rebel and do all the crazy things we do. He still said, yeah, I loved you so much, I'm sending my only begotten son here. And so I think that's just important to keep in context as we're kind of talking about this internal wrestling Jesus has in the prayer. So.
Right. Yeah, it totally makes me think of one of the worship songs that we sing, "What a Beautiful Name." And there's a verse where he says, he didn't want heaven without us.
Right.
Now, the reality was he was totally like, there was no reason. He existed just fine on his own apart from us.
Yeah.
But because of his love for us, and because it would bring glory to himself.
Yeah.
He chose this path. He chose to send Jesus.
Yeah.
He chose the incarnation.
Yeah, that's good. And so Christ is praying, Abba, Father, all things are possible. Remove this cup from me. And when he says that cup, what is he talking about there?
I think he's talking about the cup of God's wrath.
Yeah.
I mean, there's echoes of prophecy there from the Old Testament.
Right.
This is the terrible ordeal that he's going to have to endure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Because back in Mark 10, when he's talking, James and John come up to him and is like, hey, one of us wants to sit on your right and one of us wants to sit on your left. Remember, he had said, are you guys able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink? And they're like, oh, yeah. I was like, no, boys. Because the cup often in the Old Testament is that picture of, pouring out God's wrath. Yep. And so as you said earlier, Christ is fully aware of that wrath that's coming. But why is that wrath coming? Why is God doing this to Jesus then, and pouring out that wrath?
Because sin requires a sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the thing. We call this substitutionary atonement, penal substitutionary atonement. That's the theological word that we use to describe the fact that there was a price that had to be paid because of sin.
Yeah.
That the wrath of God had to be satisfied.
Yeah.
And the only way that the perfect wrath of God could be satisfied perfectly would be with a perfect sacrifice.
Right.
And that's why only Jesus could do
Yeah.
what Jesus did.
Yeah. Yeah.
Only Jesus could die once and for all of the sins of every person who ever lived.
Right.
It's the only way this works.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's important to remember as Christ is praying, obviously knowing this is the plan and knowing what he has to do, is to remember that because God is righteous, sin has to be punished.
Right.
So if there's a judge who knowingly is letting off people who have broken the law, and knows that you've broken the law, but I'm still pardoning you, then that's not a righteous judge.
Right.
None of us would look in a human court system and go, that guy knew you openly broke the law but still let you go. Well, you're not a good judge. Like none of us reasonably go, that's a good judge. And so when we think about God, because we have sinned, the wages of sin is death. And so as you said, he's that substitutionary atonement for us. He's that substitute. And I know this podcast isn't on Barabbas, but my favorite guy in the whole story, because that's the picture, is Christ took Barabbas's cross. He took his place, just like he took our place and your place and all of our listeners' place, so that we can have the forgiveness of our sin. And so, but let's get a little bit, deeper into that verse. Yet not what I will, but you will. And so I mean, is Christ really trying to get out of this? I mean, like is he? Hey, just checking one more time. There's no other way. I mean, how do you interpret that?
It's an interesting question, because that's been something that was kind of debated throughout, especially the early part of church history, was
Right.
Did Jesus have one will,
Yeah.
or did Jesus have two? In the same way that they debated, did Jesus have one nature, or did he have two natures? You know, because
Yeah.
we understand Jesus to be fully human and fully God.
Right.
You know, and so there's been this debate throughout church history of like, what exactly is Jesus saying here? Is Jesus saying that his will is different from the Father's will, and how is that possible if Jesus is God?
Right.
To me, I think it's really important to kind of read that whole sentence together. You know, where I think Jesus is really, I mean, he's asking for the cup to be taken, but he's also saying, not my will, but your will.
Right.
In other words, I think Jesus is aware
Yeah.
that there's really only one way this is going to end. This is
Right.
only one way this is going to happen. It's only one way this is going to go down. Yet in his humanity, he's still asking to be delivered from,
Right.
you know, from this horrible ordeal that he's about to experience. You know, and so I think that I think ultimately he is conforming his will to the Father's will. You know, and again, there's kind of some debate about what, you know, trying to understand, you know, Jesus in his humanity, how that's kind of functioning in that moment. But I think ultimately what's important to realize is Jesus submits himself to the will of the Father.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think that's really important as a model for us, because the reality is that in our lives, God is going to call us to do things that we don't want to do.
Right.
And hopefully it's never going to end, you know, with a horrifying death the way Jesus is going to end. But there's going to be times in our lives where we're called to do things that we don't want to do.
Yeah.
God's going to call us, and in those moments we need to conform our will to his will, and we need to be willing to submit ourselves to his will.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Jesus does, what he models for us beautifully.
Right.
You know, a lot of times we approach prayer with the idea that we're trying to change God's mind. You know, dear Lord, please do this thing. Please help this person. Please deliver this person from illness. You know, we come to the Lord asking him to change his mind. But I think a very important element of prayer is that we conform our minds to his mind.
Yeah.
You know, and as we pray and as we talk to God, we come to understand the importance of his way and submitting ourselves to his will.
Yeah. And you see that throughout the life of Christ, is that constant submission to the Father as the Son. You know, as you're talking, just thinking about the incident when he gets left behind at the temple, you know, when he's a boy, you know, and they come back and they're like, where you been? He's like, well, I've been in the temple. I'm about my Father's business, you know, and so just that always sets the stage that I'm about my Father's business. I'm constantly here to do what I was sent to do. And so here, I don't take it at all as him kind of trying to backdoor his way out, or, you know, hey, can we not? Let's just let Barabbas go. Like he really deserves it, not me. And you bring up a good point. It's prayer is really aligning our will to his, you know, and you see that here, because we know the plan. You know, Colossians 1:20, it's through, you know, Paul says, and through him to reconcile himself to all things, whether heaven or on earth, making peace by the blood of his cross. So he knows this is the way we're reconciled back to God. And you've brought up the humanity, you know, the two wills, and that is a very interesting discussion that people have. And I think about this in the spot from maybe, I guess, the human side of Jesus here, knowing that for a brief period of time, there's separation that's going to happen between God the Father and God the Son on the cross. You know, why did you forsake me? That moment's coming. And I think it's not the pain of the cross that he knows is going to happen. I think it's that's the way I've always read that, and just trying to kind of internalize that is, here you've had an eternal union that for a very brief moment, God the Father's turning his back on God the Son in judgment. And it's that he's like, I don't want that. Even though he knows I'm going to be raised from the grave. You know, I mean, just that agony of the union for that brief period of when he becomes sin for us, that relationship severed. And I think it's that agony and pain that he's already feeling of that, you know, becoming sin for us. And, our next podcast, we're going to kind of talk about what happens on the cross, but I don't want to give away the ending on that or anything. just a little preview segment. But I think it's really that, because Luke says that he's in just great agony in this prayer. I mean, this isn't just the way probably you and I pray. I mean, like this is gut-wrenching, prayer here.
If you think about the unique position that Jesus is in,
right?
The 2 Corinthians tells us that he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf.
Right.
And see, all of us know what it is like to be lost. Mm-hmm. All of us had a time in our life where we didn't know Christ, where we didn't have a relationship with God.
Yeah.
Jesus has always had a relationship with the Father.
Yeah.
And so the idea that there would be a separation there even for a time would be brand new territory for him.
Yeah.
But again, it's necessary because
right.
Jesus is the perfect sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's the fact that he knew no sin
right.
that enabled him to be sin on our behalf.
Yeah.
If Jesus had lived a sinful life, then he dies, he dies for his own sin. He doesn't die for the sin of the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I read an article recently and it was pretty heretical, by the way. I just slipped that in there as a preface. But the author was saying that Jesus didn't have to die on a cross for our salvation. Like he could have died from typhoid and we still could have been saved, because the word became flesh and just by his death, we could be reconciled, so he could have died of COVID. I know, bad joke. I mean, but he could have died of the flu and we still would have been saved. And I'm like, no, I mean, Christ clearly says, Mark 10:45, I've come to give my life as a ransom for many. Mm-hmm. And so his death is that substitutionary atonement payment for our sin, and so it's not like this was an option. I mean, this is how it works, that he had to die in this way, in this manner, to be our sacrifice. So it's not like he could have just got run over by a cart, in the middle of Jerusalem and we would have been saved. No, I mean, this was the plan of God. There was no other plan out there. So
yeah, I mean, and I think that's important to remember too, is that we can engage in hypotheticals. Could God have done something else?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, God is sovereign.
Right.
And so this was the way God chose for it to happen.
Yeah.
If he had wanted to do something else, he's God. He could have done something else.
Yeah.
But again, that's just speculation.
Right.
The reality is like this was always his plan.
Yeah.
And you've got thousands of years of biblical history pointing to this moment, and the connection with Passover and the sacrifice and the temple. I mean, God is preparing his people and for all of humanity for this moment where Jesus is going to go to the cross. And
right.
I'm thinking all the way back to Abraham and Isaac going up that mountain carrying
right.
the wood on his back.
Yep.
I mean, God's people had been prepared for this moment for thousands of years.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's good. Well, I want to just kind of encourage you on this as we are talking through this subject of the two wills and could he have done this? Could he have done that? Let me just kind of land our plane today on the podcast, so to speak, and say that here's what Christ did. He died on the cross for us, as Paul says. And on the third day, he was raised again. And in order for us to have biblical salvation and forgiveness of sin and life with God now and for all of eternity, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, this is the gospel in which was preached, in which you believe, in which you hold fast. And so let me encourage you that if you are not a believer in Jesus Christ, to first and foremost know that there is a penalty for your sin, and that penalty is death. That penalty is eternal wrath of God upon you in the lake of fire. But it is Christ who has come to die for you, to pay that penalty, to take your place. And the Bible says to turn from that sin and trust in this Jesus who has loved you and has done this for you. And so that is our first and foremost prayer out of today's episode, that if you are not a believer in Christ, then today you will be. Hebrews 4:12 says that today can be your day of salvation. And that's our prayer. That's our hope. That's our mission here at Heights, to love and to lead all people to a new life with Christ. And secondly, I just want to encourage you in prayer, just as Jesus did, it's aligning our will with God's will. So as you pray and you're asking the Lord to intercede in the life of someone else or a situation that you may have, I know it's popular sometimes to tack on the end of that prayer, God, not my will, but your will. I want to encourage you just to mean what you pray and just to ask that the Lord will bend your will to Him. And so until we see each other again next time, I want to invite you to our services in person on Sunday morning at 9 and 10:30 a.m. You can also find us on our Heights Facebook page, here on our Heights YouTube page. Make sure you click that subscribe button so you're current with all of our podcasts and sermon series and all of our other digital contexts. And so until we see each other again, God bless.